I am Hercule Poirot. Welcome to my new mystery story.
There are winters in England when the snow puts a white glove over every vulgarity, and for a night or two, the world remembers its manners. Everleigh Court, low and broad like a patient animal sleeping, wore that glove on Christmas Eve. The beech trees and clipped yews were sugared to a fine perfection, breath plumed from horses and from guests alike, and the little private chapel, a medieval relic saved from piety and damp by generations of money, glowed with a quieter light than the glittering house across the lawn. Inside the chapel, the air smelled of beeswax, old wood, and the faint iron tang of winter that clung to everyone's clothes. 12 candles stood in a silver corona upon the altar rail, a wreath like a crown, each a thick hand-rolled taper of honey-gold wax, visibly pricked with the impressions of fingers. In the center, a taller candle waited in a socket of engraved silver. Above it, suspended from the corona's arch, a tiny star of diamond was set in a clasp of angel wings. The Ashcombe star, a heirloom small as a halfpenny, but bright as a frost-sparkled morning. The family tradition, kept with the obstinacy rich families reserve for absurdities, was simple. On Christmas Eve, the matriarch lit the star candle, and the star gleamed safely above it until 12th night. It was a symbol, the guests were told. Continuity, duty, blessing. Symbols are so inconveniently flexible. Lady Isabel Ashcombe, in black velvet and pearls, stood first in the line of the transept. At 58, she had not softened into indulgence. She was a woman cut by her own discipline as cleanly as any cameo. In her hand, a silver taper holder that had once been a sword handle in the days when Ashcombes acquired things by methods no longer recounted in company. Beside her stood her nephew and heir, Nicholas, tall, pale where the winter had not spared his health, and with a healed scar at the jaw that made his smile an act of will. He was to announce an engagement, it had been hinted, though no one said to whom, and that made the organist, who was also the rector, play Once in Royal David's City with an optimism he did not otherwise feel. A house party of 9 made up the rest, each carrying their own shadows into the candle-lit sanctuary. Sir Lionel Ashcombe, Isabel's brother-in-law and co-trustee of the estate, red-faced and heavy-chinned, wearing dignity like a coat borrowed in a storm and never returned. His cane tapped impatiently on the tile, and his eyes held the particular restlessness of a man who had grown accustomed to being obeyed. Miss May Frobisher, the rumoured fiancée, famous on the West End for a face that transformed to whatever a director wanted. Tonight it wore the demure gravity that makes older women say, sensible, though her fingers worried at her gloves with an actress's awareness of every gesture. Mr. Godfrey Pike, the family solicitor, a neat little man with a neat little mind, forever polishing his glasses, without needing to. His presence at family gatherings was both expected and slightly ominous, like a well-dressed reminder of mortality. Reverend Arthur Pritchard, rector of the parish, and a man whose face suggested that he had made peace with disappointment by befriending it. His hands shook slightly as he turned the pages of his prayer book, though whether from age or nerves was impossible to determine. Mr. Hugh Whitman, an American businessman whose good humor had the peculiar quality of being entirely deliberate. He smiled with his eyes the way a duellist chooses a distance, and his presence in this ancient English chapel seemed both natural and somehow calculated. Miss Eleanor Mallory, Lady Isabel's companion, brown-eyed and quiet, observing with that still attention which timid people often have, and which is seldom really timid. She stood slightly apart from the others, as befitted her position, but her gaze was sharp and assessing. Captain Roland Pierce, Nicholas's fellow from the late war, broad-shouldered and sun-darkened even in December. He whistled under his breath until he remembered where he was, then fell silent with the particular stillness of a soldier listening for danger. Mrs. Baines, the housekeeper, invited for the chapel service as both favour and warning to the younger maids that service at Everley Court required proper gratitude. Her weathered hands were folded precisely, but her eyes never stopped moving, cataloguing every detail with professional thoroughness. Mr. Carfax, the butler, tall and mortuary as a candlestick himself, who had insisted upon overseeing the setting of the corona and the polishing of the silver. He had been overheard to remark, with the exact amount of subservience propriety demanded, that a lady might light a candle, but a servant was responsible for whether it burned. It was 5 minutes to 11. The last of the guests from the house, a painter called Ludo King, brought for the season to do a candle-lit portrait of Lady Isabel. "Candlelight is very forgiving, madam," he had said, which had not endeared him to her. Slipped into a rear pew, hair damp with snow melt and an apology poised on his lips. No one cared. The bell rope in its niche stirred once. The wind whispered at the door and fell silent. "Friends," said Lady Isabel, her voice not warm but clear and possessed of that cool authority which saves weaker people from their own enthusiasms. "On a night of peace, we do as our fathers and mothers did. We set the star, we light the candle. We remember our duty to this house and to those beyond its walls who depend upon us. Mr. Carfax." Carfax stepped forward, the star in a velvet-lined box in his hands. His face held something like awe. Or perhaps it was merely the expression of a butler who suspects things will go wrong and intends to remember the exact moment they did. He handed the velvet to Lady Isabel. She lifted the diamond from its bed and, raising it so that the small congregation saw it spark, set it deftly back into its clasp above the central socket. It clicked into place with an inaudible precision. Mr. Carfax's shoulders, which had stiffened, relaxed by an imperceptible degree. "You are all to witness," Sir Lionel announced in a voice that liked being heard. "The jewel is placed. God grant it stay so." He laughed, but his eyes flicked to Nicholas in a way that made the remark less emeritus than threat. Lady Isabel lowered her taper to the waiting wick. A moment later, the chapel smelled of sweet warm wax and something else, faint, green, like crushed laurel. The flames sprang up eager and blue at the base, then settled into a steady, civilized gold. The star above it took the light and threw it delicately back. They sang, voices blending in ancient harmonies while the snow tapped against leaded glass. Nicholas had come forward to stand just inside the chancel rail, taking the taper holder from his aunt to light the 12 smaller candles in sequence. "To absent friends," he said, and Roland Pierce's head dipped. "Then to the village, and to our labourers, and to those who have less than we, each flame carrying its private vow." It was then, just before the 9th taper, that the star shivered. No one moved for the first second. It takes time for a symbol to misbehave enough to be understood. The diamond fluttered like a moth, the clasp gleaming, and then, quite daintily, as if called, it fell. It did not tumble into the body of the central candle, as one might have expected, but dropped toward the altar rail with a sound so small that the mind refused to accept the size of its meaning. The diamond vanished. Lady Isabel's hand closed on air. "Carfax!" It was no more than a breath. "Turn up the lamps," she commanded, and Pritchard went at once to the lever that controlled the wall sconces. He pulled. For a heartbeat, the world deepened in shadow. Then all the lamps went out. The darkness that followed was absolute. The kind that crowds know, dense, living dark that fills lungs and ears and pushes at the fragile structures of the mind. In it, someone's breath shortened. A woman gave an involuntary cry. There was the heavy scuffle of a man stepping backward and striking a pew. The organ sighed as cooling pipes contracted. "Stand still," said Lady Isabel, her voice threading the blackness. "No one is to move." Someone moved. 4 seconds. The lamps returned as unceremoniously as they had gone, washing over anxieties to catch them in the act. Everyone blinked the same blank astonishment. The central candle flamed on. The 9 little wicks that Nicholas had lit burned obediently. The silver corona was unaltered except for the tiny empty clasp whose angel wings now held nothing. On the altar rail, on the stone, on the carpet, there was no diamond. Sir Lionel had sunk into a pew as if pushed there by the return of the light, his head tilted back at an unflattering angle, one hand on his chest, the other hanging loose with fingers stained as if he had been helping with the candles, which he certainly had not. Nicholas turned toward him with instinct and annoyance, but stopped when he saw the color of his uncle's mouth. It had gone the grayish-purple of bruised fruit. "Lionel," Lady Isabel said, the first hairline crack in her composure visible in the careful way she formed the name. He did not answer. He would never answer again. Dr. Felix Hammond, who had slipped in late, was already moving. "Give him air," he ordered, and people obeyed because catastrophe requires someone to obey. He knelt, felt, listened, performed all the rituals that reassure everyone but the one person who needs reassurance. He looked up into Lady Isabel's eyes and shook his head the tiniest degree. The rector began to pray in a voice he had not prepared to use. Mr. Carfax stood as if turned to cast iron. Miss Eleanor Mallory pressed a handkerchief to her mouth without making a sound. Captain Pierce leaned his knuckles on the pew in front of him as if pressing down could reverse a fact. "Close the doors," Lady Isabel said once, and Mr. Carfax did so. "No one is to leave." The star candle burned with its decorous flame. If there was any scent of laurel left in the air, it had the good manners to pretend otherwise. And if any of those present, looking at Sir Lionel in his final untidiness, thought of the small smear of golden wax like a tear on the cuff of his glove, they did not say so aloud. Lady Isabel lifted the silver taper holder and set it on the rail as if it might begin to speak. "The star's gone," she said. "My brother-in-law is dead." She looked at each of them in turn, long enough to hurt and not long enough to accuse. "We shall send for the police. We shall also, at once, send for Monsieur Hercule Poirot." The name fell into the silence and sat there like a carefully placed object. Foreign, precise, not to be mistaken for anything else. Those who had heard it before looked at one another with a kind of double relief. The relief of people who trust a surgeon and the relief of people who wonder whether their first answer will sound convincing. The Christmas candle. Conspiracy had begun, and somewhere among the assembled mourners, a murderer walked free, confident that their perfect crime would remain forever hidden. They had not reckoned with the little grey cells of the most famous detective in Europe. Snow continued to fall as the immediate shock gave way to the practical necessities of sudden death and theft. Dr. Hammond covered Sir Lionel's face with his own silk handkerchief, a small dignity in circumstances stripped of it. The chapel air, still heavy with beeswax and that faint, troubling scent of something green, seemed to press upon the assembled guests like a weight. Lady Isabel stood motionless at the altar rail, her black-gloved hands flat upon the oak as if drawing strength from its solidity. Mr. Carfax moved with funeral efficiency, securing the chapel doors and dispatching young Tom, the footman, to telephone the constabulary. Mrs. Baines shepherded the more distressed guests toward the house, her weathered face set in lines of professional competence. "Hot tea in the morning room," she announced, as if warmth and routine might restore the natural order of things. The local inspector arrived within the hour, a solid, red-faced man named Davies, whose experience with violent death extended little beyond the occasional poaching dispute. He surveyed the chapel with the careful attention of someone who understood his limitations, photographing Sir Lionel's position, questioning each witness with methodical thoroughness, and taking careful notes in a hand that betrayed his unease with such grand surroundings. "The diamond now," Davies said, crouching beside the altar rail with his flashlight. Valuable piece, I'm told. Could have rolled anywhere in the dark. His constable crawled between the pews, searching every crevice, but found nothing. No glint of diamond, no scratches on stone, no displaced dust. The Ashcombe star had vanished as completely as if it had never existed. Dr. Hammond provided his preliminary assessment with professional detachment. Heart failure, most likely. The shock of the moment, perhaps. Sir Lionel was not a young man and prone to excitement. Davies nodded, relief evident in his face. A natural death, while tragic, was far simpler than murder, especially with a missing family heirloom. It was precisely at 10:30 the following morning when the distinctive purr of a motor car announced a different sort of arrival. Lady Isabel, who had spent a sleepless night reviewing estate papers with grim efficiency, watched from her study window as a small, immaculately dressed figure emerged from the passenger seat. Even at a distance, there was something unmistakable about the way Hercule Poirot adjusted his coat against the falling snow. A gesture that suggested weather was merely another problem to be solved through proper attention to detail. Poirot paused at the chapel entrance, his gloved hands clasped behind his back, studying the ancient stonework with the concentrated interest of a man reading a particularly complex text. He examined the doorframe, the worn threshold, even the iron hinges, as if they might whisper secrets to someone who knew how to listen. "Interesting," he murmured, kneeling to brush away fresh snow and reveal older footprints beneath. Someone walked here in the early morning before the household stirred. Size 9 boots with a distinctive wear pattern. Inside the chapel, Poirot moved with the methodical precision of a clockmaker. He examined the altar rail where the star had vanished, running his fingers along the stone with surprising gentleness. When he reached the silver corona, still suspended above the central candle socket, he produced his magnifying glass and studied the tiny clasp with minute attention. "Curious," he said after several minutes of silent examination. "The clasp, it is not broken. The mechanism works perfectly. Yet the star fell at precisely the moment when the lights failed. A remarkable coincidence, n'est-ce pas?" Inspector Davies shifted uncomfortably. "Could have been planned that way, sir. Someone who knew the chapel well enough." "Ah, but consider the timing, mon ami." Poirot straightened, brushing imaginary dust from his coat. "The star falls, the lights fail, Sir Lionel dies, all within perhaps 30 seconds. Either we have a criminal of extraordinary preparation, or—" He paused, his green eyes thoughtful. "Or we have something more complex than simple theft." Lady Isabel entered at that moment, dressed entirely in black, her composure absolute despite the slight tremor in her hands as she approached the altar rail. "Monsieur Poirot," she said, her voice carrying the particular clarity of grief held firmly in check. "I trust you have found something to help us understand what happened here." "I have found many things, madame," Poirot replied with a small bow. "Whether they will help, that remains to be seen. But first, I should like to speak with each of your guests individually. The human mind, it is like a photograph taken in poor light. Sometimes the details become clear only with proper development." As they prepared to leave the chapel, Poirot paused once more at the altar rail, his expression thoughtful. In his experience, the most dangerous criminals were those who understood that the perfect crime left not no clues, but too many. The morning room at Everley Court provided an appropriately formal setting for Poirot's methodical inquiry. He had arranged himself behind Lady Isabel's mahogany writing desk with characteristic precision, his small hands folded before him, while Inspector Davies occupied a chair nearby with the resigned air of a man watching a master craftsman at work. The fire crackled softly in the grate, casting dancing shadows that seemed to emphasize the gravity of their task. Reverend Pritchard entered first, his thin frame betraying a nervousness that daylight had only intensified. His hands trembled more visibly now, and he clutched his prayer book as if it might anchor him to safer ground. "Monsieur le Recteur," Poirot began with gentle courtesy, You understand this chapel intimately, n'est-ce pas? 20 years of service leaves few mysteries. Indeed, yes. Pritchard's voice carried the particular strain of a man who had spent the night questioning divine providence, though last evening presented mysteries I had never encountered. The electrical system, for instance. You pulled the lever to illuminate the lamps, yet they failed completely. This has occurred before? Pritchard nodded eagerly, as if grateful for a technical question. The wiring is modern work grafted onto medieval bones. In very cold weather, the system sometimes draws too much power at once and trips the main breaker. Usually it resets automatically within seconds. Usually. Poirot's green eyes fixed on the rector with uncomfortable intensity. And this morning, monsieur, you visited the chapel again. At what hour? The question struck like a physical blow. Pritchard's face went ashen and his grip tightened on the prayer book. How did you... The footprints in the snow, they tell their own story. Size 9 boots with a distinctive wear pattern on the left heel. You walked there before the household stirred. At 7 o'clock, Pritchard admitted in a whisper. I went to pray for Sir Lionel's soul. It seemed proper, given the circumstances. And your boots, they are remarkably clean for such weather. I removed them at the porch. There are felt slippers kept there for such purposes. The rector's voice grew stronger as he found his footing in routine. I have done so for 20 years. Poirot nodded thoughtfully, filing away this detail with the others. When he dismissed Pritchard, the man fled with obvious relief. Nicholas Ashcombe entered with Miss May Frobisher at his side, though Poirot gestured for her to wait outside. The young man's pallor had deepened overnight, and the scar along his jaw stood out like a white thread against his skin. You inherit everything now, Poirot stated without preamble, watching carefully for the reaction. Nicholas flinched as if struck. My uncle's death brings me no joy, Monsieur Poirot. The inheritance was always expected, but not like this. Expected, yes. But Sir Lionel had reservations about your readiness, did he not? He believed I lacked proper seriousness. Nicholas's voice carried a note of long-suppressed resentment. The war changed me, but not in ways he could understand. He preferred his authority to be more direct, less complicated by modern sensibilities. And the engagement to Miss Frobisher. He approved. Nicholas's hand moved unconsciously to touch his scar, a gesture Poirot noted with interest. He felt she lacked the proper background for estate management, as if love were merely another business transaction to be negotiated. When Miss Frobisher was finally admitted, she moved with the controlled grace of someone accustomed to being observed under harsh lights. Her composure bore the particular quality of performance under strain. Mademoiselle, Poirot began, your profession trains you to observe details others might miss. In the darkness last night, what did you see? She considered carefully before answering. I saw the star quiver as if suspended on an invisible thread, then drop. There was a movement in the shadows near the second pew, someone shifting position just as the lights failed. Someone you recognized. The darkness came too quickly, but I heard something else, a sound like fabric brushing against stone, and then... She paused, her actress's instincts clearly warring with discretion. A faint scent, green and bitter, like crushed leaves. Poirot's eyebrows rose fractionally. Crushed leaves? You are certain? Quite certain. It was distinct from the beeswax and winter air. When she departed, Poirot sat in contemplative silence, his fingers steepled before him. The pattern was beginning to emerge, not of simple theft or natural death, but of something far more complex and carefully orchestrated. Inspector Davies, he said finally, we are dealing with a mind that understands misdirection. The theft of the star, the convenient electrical failure, even Sir Lionel's death. They are all pieces of a single design. The snow continued to fall beyond the windows, and somewhere in the house, A murderer walked free, confident their perfect crime would remain forever hidden. The morning room fire had settled into a steady glow when Poirot requested his next interview. Mr. Carfax entered with the measured dignity of a man who had spent decades perfecting the art of being indispensable without being intrusive. His long face bore the particular gravity that butlers reserve for occasions when their household's reputation hangs in the balance. Monsieur Carfax, Poirot began, his hands folded precisely before him, you are the guardian of this house's most precious objects. Yesterday you handled the Ashcombe Star personally. Tell me, if you please, every detail of its preparation. Carfax's response was methodical, each word chosen with care. The chapel preparations began at 4 o'clock, sir. Mrs. Baines attended to the cleaning while I polished the silver corona and examined the clasp mechanism. It was perfectly sound. I tested it twice. The star remained in the strong box in my pantry until Lady Isabel requested it at 20 minutes to 11. The strong box. How many keys exist? 2 only, sir. Mine and Lady Isabel's. No duplicates have ever been made. Poirot's green eyes sharpened with interest. And the central candle? It is replaced each year? No, sir. It is a special piece, hand-molded from our own beeswax years ago. We reuse it annually, storing it wrapped in linen between ceremonies. Most economical, and it maintains the tradition. When Carfax departed, Poirot summoned Mrs. Baines, whose weathered hands and shrewd eyes spoke of decades managing the practical mysteries of a great house. Her testimony proved equally illuminating. The candles are kept in the upstairs linen press, sir, cool and dark as beeswax requires. But last night, she hesitated, then set her jaw with determination. There was something wrong with the scent. Not the usual honey sweetness, but something sharp and bitter, like crushed bay leaves. I thought it might be the old stone catching a draught, but it was stronger than that. Laurel, Poirot murmured, filing away this crucial detail. And who had access to the candle yesterday? Mr. Carfax and myself at 4 o'clock, working together. Before that, Miss Mallory dusted the altar rail while I fetched the cleaning cloths. She's a careful girl. Would never presume to touch what wasn't her place. The next interview brought Mr. Godfrey Pike, the family solicitor, whose neat appearance and precise movements suggested a mind accustomed to navigating the treacherous currents of family law. His testimony revealed depths that Poirot had suspected, but not yet confirmed. Sir Lionel had grown increasingly concerned about Nicholas's readiness to inherit, Pike admitted, polishing his spectacles with nervous precision. There had been discussions about extending the trusteeship arrangements, perhaps indefinitely. Such measures would require Lady Isabel's consent, which she had grown reluctant to provide. And Sir Lionel's financial affairs? Complicated. He had made certain investments, not entirely prudent ones. Nothing that would compromise the estate, but enough to cause him considerable distress. He was also involved in negotiations with Mr. Whitman regarding timber rights, though those discussions had grown contentious. Captain Roland Pierce entered next, his military bearing evident despite the civilian clothes. His weathered face and alert eyes spoke of dangers survived and lessons learned at considerable cost. When Poirot questioned him about the previous evening's events, Pierce's response carried the weight of battlefield experience. "I've seen men die in combat, Monsieur Poirot," he said quietly. What happened to Sir Lionel looked different from a simple heart attack. His pupils were dilated, and there was a peculiar odor, bitter like almonds, but not quite. Just before the lights failed, I saw him reach toward his coat pocket as if grasping for something. His hand bore dark stains like soot or perhaps melted wax. "You suspect poison?" "I suspect deliberate action." Sir Lionel was not a popular man, particularly with those who crossed his business interests or challenged his authority over the estate. As Pierce departed, Poirot sat in contemplative silence, his mind assembling the emerging pattern. The theft of the star, the convenient electrical failure, The suspicious death. Each element had been carefully orchestrated by someone with intimate knowledge of both the chapel's mechanics and the family's dynamics. "Inspector Davies," Poirot said finally, "we are not dealing with coincidence, but with calculation. Someone understood precisely how to manipulate both circumstance and human nature to achieve their goal." The snow continued falling beyond the windows, and somewhere in the house, a murderer walked free, confident their perfect crime would remain forever hidden among the shadows of Christmas tradition. The afternoon light filtering through the morning room windows had grown pale and winter-thin when Poirot called for Miss Eleanor Mallory. Lady Isabel's companion entered with the careful movements of someone long accustomed to occupying the margins of other people's lives. Yet her brown eyes held an alertness that suggested she missed very little of what occurred within those margins. "Mademoiselle Mallory," Poirot began with gentle courtesy, "you assist with the chapel preparations, I understand. Your duties bring you into contact with details others might overlook." She settled into the chair with practiced invisibility, her hands folded precisely in her lap. "I dust the chapel weekly, Monsieur Poirot. Yesterday morning I noticed something unusual about the central candle. There were fresh fingerprints in the wax, small ones, suggesting a woman's hands. That hadn't been there during my previous cleaning." Poirot's green eyes sharpened with interest. "You mentioned this to no one?" It seemed presumptuous. Perhaps Mrs. Baines had examined it during her preparations. Miss Mallory's fingers twisted slightly, betraying her nervousness. But there was something else. When I was arranging the prayer books after the service, I found this tucked behind one of the kneelers. From her reticule, she produced a small vial, clear glass no larger than a thimble, with traces of an oily residue clinging to its interior. The cork stopper bore faint tooth marks, as if someone had removed it in desperate haste. Poirot accepted the vial with the reverence due to crucial evidence, holding it to the fading light. The residue gleamed with a faintly greenish tint, and when he carefully removed the cork, an unmistakable scent emerged, bitter, sharp, like crushed laurel leaves mixed with something medicinal. "The scent that others described," he murmured, more to himself than to Miss Mallory. "You kept this secret until now. Why?" Her composure cracked slightly. "I wasn't certain it was connected. But after hearing the others describe that bitter odor," she pressed her handkerchief to her lips, "I couldn't ignore it any longer." When Miss Mallory departed, Poirot requested Mr. Hugh Whitman. The American entered with his characteristic confidence, though something in his manner suggested the careful control of a man walking on uncertain ground. His jovial smile seemed more effortful now, and perspiration beaded his forehead despite the room's moderate temperature. "Terrible business, this," Whitman began, settling into the chair with the practiced ease of countless boardroom negotiations. "Sir Lionel was a formidable opponent, even if we didn't always see eye to eye on the timber contracts." "Ah, yes, these contracts," Poirot said, his voice carrying deceptive mildness. "Captain Pierce mentioned your discussions had become contentious." Whitman's composure flickered momentarily. "Sir Lionel drove a hard bargain, I'll give him that. He discovered certain irregularities in our preliminary surveys. Nothing illegal, you understand, but perhaps not entirely transparent. He was threatening to void our agreements unless we renegotiated substantially in his favor. Expensive irregularities, one imagines? Potentially ruinous ones." The admission came with obvious reluctance. Sir Lionel had documentation that could have destroyed my reputation in England, possibly triggered investigations back in Boston. He was not a man to accept half measures or compromise. Poirot noted how Whitman's hands gripped the chair arms with increasing tension. "And your whereabouts during the electrical failure?" "Standing near the back pews with the others. When the darkness came, I heard someone moving, fabric rustling against stone, but couldn't see anything. Just before the lights failed, though, I caught a glimpse of movement near the altar, a shadow detaching itself from the wall. Too fleeting to identify, but definitely deliberate." After Whitman's departure, Dr. Hammond arrived with the results of his more thorough examination of Sir Lionel's remains. His professional detachment barely concealed his growing unease as he delivered his findings. The preliminary cardiac arrest diagnosis requires revision, Hammond reported, settling his medical bag beside the desk. The discoloration around the fingernails, the dilated pupils, the peculiar odor Captain Pierce mentioned. These suggest exposure to a cardiac stimulant, likely plant-derived. The absorption pattern indicates skin contact rather than ingestion. Digitalis, Poirot suggested, though his tone suggested he already suspected otherwise. Possibly, though the presentation is unusual. More consistent with cherry laurel compounds, prussic acid derivatives that cause rapid heart failure in someone of Sir Lionel's age and condition. The bitter almond scent would be characteristic, though masked by other odors in the chapel. As Dr. Hammond departed, Inspector Davies burst into the room with the triumphant air of a man who believed he had solved the case. His face flushed with excitement. He clutched a small evidence bag containing what appeared to be another vial. "Monsieur Poirot, we've found the smoking gun," Davies announced breathlessly. "Hidden in Mr. Whitman's luggage, another vial, this one completely empty but reeking of that same bitter scent." Combined with his financial motives and the contentious negotiations, it's clear he poisoned Sir Lionel and used the confusion to steal the star. Poirot listened with patient attention, his head tilted slightly, his fingers steepled before him. When Davies finished his enthusiastic exposition, the Belgian detective sighed, a sound like air escaping from a punctured balloon. "Inspector," Poirot said gently, "your theory possesses the virtue of simplicity and the appeal of swift resolution. Indeed, it is almost too perfect." He tapped one manicured finger against the desk. "But consider, if Monsieur Whitman wished to eliminate Sir Lionel, why choose such a complex method? A businessman of his experience would surely prefer efficiency over theatrical flourish. Moreover, the timing suggests intimate knowledge of the chapel's electrical system and the ceremonies precise. Choreography, knowledge our American friend would not possess." Davies' face fell as the implications sank in. "But the evidence tells us someone wished us to suspect Monsieur Whitman," Poirot replied, rising from his chair with characteristic precision. "A most clever misdirection, but not the truth. The real criminal understands that the perfect crime leaves not no clues, but too many, all pointing in carefully orchestrated directions." As the winter afternoon faded into early evening, Poirot stood at the window watching snow continue to fall across the grounds of Everley Court. Somewhere within these walls walked a murderer of extraordinary cunning, one who had orchestrated not merely a theft and a killing, but an entire symphony of deception designed to confound even the most careful investigation. The little grey cells, however, were beginning to impose their own order upon the chaos. As the winter afternoon deepened into evening, Poirot requested that Lady Isabel join him once more, this time accompanied by Mr. Pike. The solicitor entered with his characteristic precision, though his usual composure bore hairline cracks that suggested the day's revelations had shaken his professional equanimity. "Madame," Poirot began, his green eyes fixed on Lady Isabel with uncomfortable intensity, "there are certain financial arrangements regarding the star that require clarification. The insurance, for instance. It was recently amended." Lady Isabel's fingers tightened almost imperceptibly on her black gloves. "A prudent revaluation last month. Mr. Pike advised it, given the presence of strangers in the house during the season. The policy was increased substantially," Pike added, polishing his spectacles with nervous precision. "There is a waiting period for certain clauses, though whether it bears upon last night's events." He trailed off as Lady Isabel's glance froze him mid-sentence. Poirot nodded thoughtfully, filing away this information with characteristic care. "And your brother-in-law, he carried certain documents with him yesterday. A leather portfolio, perhaps?" The question struck like a physical blow. Lady Isabel's composure cracked slightly, revealing the exhaustion beneath her iron control. Lionel came to my study yesterday morning, highly agitated. He claimed to have discovered something devastating about one of our guests, evidence that could destroy them utterly. He spoke of justice and retribution, of secrets demanding exposure. This portfolio, where is it now? That troubles me most, Monsieur Poirot. I searched his room thoroughly after the tragedy. The portfolio has vanished as completely as the star itself. When they departed, Poirot summoned Carfax with a specific request. The silver taper holder, if you please. I wish to examine it once more. The butler brought it on a tray, his long face bearing the particular gravity of a man whose household's reputation hung in the balance. Poirot lifted the ornate piece, studying the chased handle where a thumb would naturally rest. He brought it delicately to his nose, and his eyes narrowed with sudden interest. It has been cleaned this morning. Yes, sir, as I do after every ceremony. Not so thoroughly as usual, perhaps. Poirot's voice carried gentle reproach. There remains here in this groove a trace of something, a faint odor, green and bitter. Carfax looked genuinely stricken. I beg pardon, sir. The light is poor in the pantry on winter mornings. Pray have it locked away. No one is to handle it further. Poirot then requested a return to the chapel, accompanied by Davies and Carfax. The sacred space felt different in the fading light. Colder, more austere, as if the morning's tragedy had drained warmth from the very stones. At the altar rail, Poirot produced a plain pin and, with a murmured apology to tradition, pressed it delicately into the central candle's surface. The wax yielded with odd resilience, as if its composition were not uniform. When he withdrew the pin, a thread of paler wax clung to it, along with a smear that glistened faintly green before dulling to nothing. You observe, Inspector, not pure beeswax. It has been adulterated, with laurel essence, perhaps, and something to soften the consistency. Davies leaned closer, sniffing skeptically. Smells like nothing to me. To the nose that expects only hay, a rose appears deficient, Poirot replied with a thin smile. He then examined the angel wing clasp above the socket with his magnifying glass. Under scrutiny, a tiny nick appeared on the inner curve, as if a fine filament had worn a groove there. On the altar rail itself, he discovered a shallow hairline channel polished bright by recent friction. Silk thread, he murmured, extracting a tiny fiber from a crevice below the rail. Black silk, not horsehair. When Ludo King was summoned, the artist entered with paint-stained cuffs and disheveled hair, the appearance of a man who had spent the day wrestling with both grief and inspiration. You work with wax mediums, monsieur, Poirot observed. You understand their properties. Encaustic work, yes. Sometimes I use bay laurel oil, just a drop or two to keep the wax plastic. Powerful on the nose, but harmless in small quantities. King's eyes darted nervously. I may have left a small vial in the chapel yesterday while studying the light. Professional habit. And black silk? For canvas backing, squaring compositions. I carry various materials. His voice carried defensive bravado. Search me if you wish. As King departed, Poirot stood in contemplative silence, the pattern finally emerging with crystalline clarity. The poisoned candle, the silk-guided theft, the electrical failure, each element orchestrated by someone with intimate knowledge of both the chapel's mechanics and the family's deepest vulnerabilities. Inspector, he said quietly, we are witnessing not coincidence, but calculation of the highest order. The snow continued falling beyond the windows, and somewhere within Everleigh Court's walls, a murderer of extraordinary cunning waited, confident their perfect crime would remain forever hidden among the shadows of Christmas tradition. The drawing room at Everleigh Court had taken on the oppressive quality of a courtroom as evening shadows lengthened beyond the frost-etched windows. Poirot had requested the presence of all guests, and they gathered with the reluctant obedience of people who understood that evasion was no longer possible. Lady Isabel presided from her usual chair beside the fire, her black mourning dress making her appear carved from obsidian. The others arranged themselves with careful attention to distance and angle, as if proximity might betray guilt through contagion. "Mesdames et messieurs," Poirot began, his compact figure commanding attention despite its modest stature. The events of last evening were not the product of coincidence, but of calculation most precise. Sir Lionel Ashcombe was murdered, and the theft of the Ashcombe star was not the crime, but the camouflage. Dr. Hammond shifted forward in his chair, his medical training evident in his focused attention. "The poison? Ah, Docteur, you have anticipated correctly. The central candle had been adulterated with essence of cherry laurel, a substance that releases prussic acid compounds when heated. Sir Lionel, in his role as lighter of the surrounding tapers, inhaled concentrated vapors that triggered immediate cardiac arrest. The bitter almond scent that Captain Pierce detected was the signature of this most elegant murder weapon." Captain Pierce nodded grimly. "I've encountered similar compounds in the colonies, deadly in small quantities, especially to someone of Sir Lionel's age and constitution." Poirot's green eyes moved systematically across each face, noting the minute reactions that betrayed inner turmoil. But the preparation required intimate knowledge, not merely of chemistry, but of our victim's habits and the ceremony's precise choreography. The murderer knew that Sir Lionel would insist upon lighting the tapers himself, that he would lean close to the central flame, that his breathing would be deep and regular in the chapel's cold air. Miss Frobisher's hands tightened in her lap, while Reverend Pritchard clutched his prayer book as if it might anchor him to safer ground. Mr. Carfax stood at attention near the door, his butler's training warring with obvious anxiety. "As for the star," Poirot continued, producing a small evidence bag containing the silk fiber he had discovered, its disappearance was accomplished through mechanical precision disguised as supernatural occurrence. A black silk thread, nearly invisible in the chapel's dim light, was attached to the diamond and passed through the angel wing clasp. The thread ran down the back of the corona and across the altar rail where it could be manipulated by someone positioned nearby. Lady Isabel leaned forward slightly, her composure cracking just enough to reveal genuine curiosity. But the electrical failure, surely that was coincidental. "Non, madame. The timing was too perfect. Someone with knowledge of the chapel's electrical system understood precisely how to overload the circuits at the crucial moment. The failure provided the darkness necessary to retrieve both diamond and thread, leaving no trace of the mechanism." Ludo King cleared his throat nervously. "I admitted to having black silk and laurel oil in my supplies. Surely that makes me the obvious suspect?" Poirot smiled with the patience of a teacher addressing a particularly slow student. "Monsieur King, your confession was most convenient. Too convenient, perhaps. The true criminal understood that obvious guilt often deflects suspicion from subtler forms of culpability." It was then that Mr. Carfax stepped forward with obvious reluctance, his long face bearing the particular gravity of a servant forced to deliver unwelcome news. "Forgive the interruption, sir, but I have discovered something troubling. Sir Lionel's study has been disturbed. Papers have been removed from his desk, and there are ashes in the fireplace that were not there yesterday morning." The silence that followed was absolute, broken only by the soft hiss of burning logs. Poirot's expression sharpened with interest. "Show me, if you please." They processed to Sir Lionel's study like mourners following a hearse. The room bore the subtle signs of careful search. Books slightly displaced, desk drawers not quite properly closed, the leather blotter askew by perhaps an inch. In the fireplace, cold ashes revealed the ghostly remnants of burned paper, though nothing remained legible save for a corner fragment bearing Sir Lionel's distinctive handwriting, background unverifiable, immediate investigation required. "The portfolio," Lady Isabel whispered, her composure finally cracking. Lionel carried it with him yesterday, claimed it contained evidence that could destroy someone utterly. He spoke of justice and retribution, of secrets demanding exposure. Poirot knelt beside the fireplace with the reverence of an archaeologist examining ancient ruins. Using delicate tongs, he extracted a partially burned fragment of leather and a twisted remnant of what might once have been a photograph. The destruction was thorough but hasty, he observed. Our criminal possessed enough knowledge to know what must be eliminated, but not enough time to ensure complete success. Returning to the drawing room, Poirot positioned himself once again before the fire, his manner suggesting a professor approaching his most crucial lecture. We now understand the method, mes amis, but method without motive is merely academic exercise. Sir Lionel had discovered something, some secret so damaging that murder became preferable to exposure. His gaze moved deliberately from face to face, lingering just long enough to create discomfort without quite constituting accusation. Miss Eleanor Mallory, usually invisible in her corner, seemed to shrink further into the shadows. Mr. Whitman's jovial confidence had evaporated entirely, replaced by the wary alertness of a cornered animal. Nicholas stood rigid beside his aunt's chair, his scar standing out white against his pale skin. The planted evidence against Monsieur Whitman was cleverly done, Poirot continued. The vial in his luggage, the convenient financial motive, all designed to provide the authorities with a swift and satisfying conclusion. But our criminal made one crucial error. They assumed that obvious guilt would blind us to the more subtle truth. Mrs. Baines pressed her handkerchief to her lips, while Dr. Hammond nodded grimly. The assembled guests exchanged glances, heavy with suspicion, each wondering what secrets their companions might harbor. Tomorrow, Poirot announced with quiet authority, we shall examine what remains of Sir Lionel's evidence. Tonight I suggest you all consider whether conscience might provide a more comfortable resolution than continued deception. As the gathering dispersed, each guest carrying their private burden of guilt or fear, Poirot remained by the fire, his expression thoughtful. The little grey cells had begun to impose their inexorable order upon the chaos, and somewhere among the departing figures walked a murderer whose perfect crime was beginning to unravel like a poorly woven tapestry. The Christmas candle conspiracy was approaching its climax, and with it the moment when all masks would fall away to reveal the truth beneath. The first pale light of dawn found Hercule Poirot in Sir Lionel's study, where the cold morning air still carried the acrid ghost of burned paper. Inspector Davies, somewhat chastened by the previous evening's revelations, watched as the Belgian detective arranged his tools with characteristic precision. Delicate jeweler's tweezers, a magnifying glass, and several clean white handkerchiefs laid out like surgical instruments. The destruction was thorough but hasty, Poirot murmured, kneeling beside the fireplace with the reverence of an archaeologist examining ancient ruins. Our criminal possessed enough knowledge to know what must be eliminated, but not enough time to ensure complete success. With painstaking care, he sifted through the fine ash, separating the charred remnants of documents from ordinary fireplace debris. The fragment bearing Sir Lionel's handwriting, background unverifiable, immediate investigation required, was placed on the first handkerchief. Beside it, he laid a twisted, blackened sliver that had once been a photograph. Under his magnifying glass, the photograph fragment revealed its secrets reluctantly. No larger than a thumbnail and badly scorched, it showed a sliver of a woman's face with a distinctive, severe hairstyle, utterly unlike the fashionable coiffures of the present day. But what captured Poirot's attention was not the face itself, but a minute detail in the background, a faint pattern of decorative plasterwork that spoke of institutional origins, perhaps a school or hospital from a bygone era. Institutional architecture, Poirot observed, his voice carrying the satisfaction of a man finding the precise piece needed to complete a puzzle. the kind found in reformatories, workhouses, or charitable institutions, places where young women might be reformed or educated to respectability. Davies leaned closer, squinting at the fragment. Can't make out much of anything, if you ask me. Precisely the point, mon ami. This photograph was not destroyed because of what it clearly showed, but because of what it might reveal to someone with the proper knowledge. Poirot carefully wrapped the evidence. Sir Lionel had discovered someone's carefully constructed past, a past that required considerable effort to obscure. They were interrupted by the arrival of Mrs. Baines, whose weathered face bore the particular strain of a woman who had spent the night wrestling with unwelcome thoughts. "Begging your pardon, sir," she addressed Poirot with obvious reluctance, "but there's something I must tell you about Miss Mallory." Poirot's green eyes sharpened with interest. "Continue, madame." "She came to me yesterday morning, before the service, asking about the old staff records. Wanted to know if we kept photographs of previous employees. Said she was helping Lady Isabel with some family history project." Mrs. Baines twisted her hands in her apron. "I thought it strange at the time, but the girl's always been helpful with such things." "And these records, where are they kept?" "In Sir Lionel's study, sir. In the cabinet behind his desk." Poirot moved immediately to examine the cabinet, noting the subtle signs of recent disturbance. Drawers not quite properly closed, files slightly displaced. Inside, he discovered a gap where several folders had been removed, their absence marked by dust patterns on the shelves. "The timing is most instructive," Poirot observed, his fingers tracing the empty spaces. "Someone required access to these records urgently, yet dared not request them openly. They waited until the household was distracted by tragedy." As they prepared to leave the study, Poirot paused at Sir Lionel's desk, his attention caught by something that had previously escaped notice. In the leather blotter's corner, pressed into the soft material by the weight of writing, were the faint impressions of words written on paper that had since been removed. Using the side of a pencil, he carefully shaded over the impressions, revealing their ghostly message. "Morrison, Ellen Morrison, Millfield Institution, 1908-1912. "Millfield Institution," Poirot repeated thoughtfully. "Inspector, I believe we shall find that establishment was a reformatory for wayward girls, closed some years ago due to scandal." The pieces were falling into place with crystalline clarity. The institutional plasterwork in the photograph, the severe hairstyle of a bygone era, the carefully researched staff records, all pointed to someone whose past had been not merely obscured, but entirely reinvented. As they returned to the main house, Poirot encountered Miss Eleanor Mallory in the corridor, carrying Lady Isabel's morning correspondence with her usual quiet efficiency. Her brown eyes met his with that still attention he had noted before, but now he recognized it for what it truly was. Not timidity, but the watchful alertness of someone perpetually on guard. "Good morning, mademoiselle," Poirot said with gentle courtesy. "I trust you slept well despite the tragic circumstances?" "As well as could be expected, Monsieur Poirot." Her voice carried its usual soft modulation, but her fingers tightened almost imperceptibly on the letters. "Such events disturb the natural order of things." "Indeed they do. Tell me, have you ever visited Millfield in Yorkshire? A charming district, I am told, though perhaps changed much in recent years." The question struck like a physical blow. Miss Mallory's composure cracked for just an instant, a flutter of the eyelids, a barely perceptible intake of breath, before reasserting itself with remarkable control. "I'm afraid I'm not familiar with that region, sir. My background is quite humble and travel has been limited." "Of course," Poirot replied with perfect politeness. "Forgive my curiosity. The mind, it makes connections where perhaps none exist." As Miss Mallory continued down the corridor with measured steps, Poirot watched her retreat with the satisfaction of a hunter who has finally located his quarry. The little grey cells had done their work, imposing order upon the chaos of deception and misdirection. "Inspector," he said quietly. "We are very close now to our resolution. Tonight, I believe, we shall invite our murderer to reveal themselves through the simple expedient of offering them exactly what they most desire and what they most fear. The Christmas candle." Conspiracy was approaching its climax, and somewhere within the walls of Everley Court, a killer of extraordinary cunning was about to discover that the perfect crime exists only in the imagination of those who commit it. The drawing room at Everley Court had assumed the gravity of a courtroom as the winter evening deepened beyond the frost-etched windows. Poirot had requested the presence of all guests, ostensibly to discuss certain administrative matters regarding Sir Lionel's papers, but the careful arrangement of chairs and the presence of Inspector Davies suggested more serious business. Lady Isabel presided from her usual position beside the fire, her black mourning dress making her appear carved from obsidian against the flickering light. The others had arranged themselves with the unconscious choreography of people who understood that proximity might suggest complicity. Nicholas stood behind his aunt's chair, his pale features drawn with exhaustion. Miss Frobisher occupied a chair near the window, her actress's composure brittle as winter glass. Mr. Pike polished his spectacles with nervous precision, while Reverend Pritchard clutched his prayer book like a talisman. Captain Pierce maintained his soldier's alertness, and Mrs. Baines twisted her hands in her apron. Mr. Carfax stood at attention near the door, his butler's training warring with obvious anxiety. Miss Eleanor Mallory sat slightly apart from the others, her brown eyes fixed on her folded hands with that still attention Poirot had noted from the beginning. But now he recognized it for what it truly was. Not timidity, but the watchful alertness of someone perpetually calculating escape routes. "Mesdames et messieurs," Poirot began, his compact figure commanding attention despite its modest stature, "this afternoon brought confirmation of certain suspicions. A telegram from Yorkshire has provided most illuminating information about Millfield Institution for Wayward Girls, closed in 1912 following a scandal involving forged references and false identities." He produced the telegram with characteristic precision. Several inmates disappeared during the chaos, including one Ellen Morrison, age 16, described as intelligent, manipulative, and possessed of remarkable facility for assuming different personas. The institution specialized in providing new identities to young women seeking to escape their criminal pasts. Miss Mallory's head rose slowly, her composure intact, but something flickering behind her eyes like candlelight in a draught. Sir Lionel's investigation had uncovered this information. Poirot continued, his green eyes moving systematically across each face. The photograph he possessed, now destroyed, showed Ellen Morrison as she was in 1912. The documents burned in his fireplace contained references to Millfield Institution and detailed records of false placements. Lady Isabel leaned forward slightly, her voice carefully controlled. "Are you suggesting that Miss Mallory is this Ellen Morrison?" "I am suggesting, madame, that your trusted companion has lived under an assumed identity for over a decade, supported by fabricated references and a carefully constructed past. The Pemberton agency that provided her credentials exists only on letterhead. Their supposed placements are elaborate fictions." Miss Mallory straightened in her chair, and for the first time since entering the room, she looked directly at Poirot. The transformation was subtle but unmistakable. The quiet companion had not vanished, but something harder showed through the careful mask. "Even if your accusations were true, Monsieur Poirot," she said, her voice losing some of its soft modulation, "what bearing would this have on Sir Lionel's death? I am no poisoner." "Ah, but you are a woman of remarkable resourcefulness," Poirot replied. "Someone who understood that exposure meant not merely dismissal, but likely prosecution for fraud. Someone with intimate knowledge of this household's routines, access to the chapel's preparations, and the intelligence to orchestrate a most complex deception." He moved to the window, gazing out at the falling snow. The central candle required someone familiar with its storage and handling. The electrical failure needed precise timing and knowledge of the chapel's systems. The theft of the star demanded not merely opportunity, but a hiding place so secure that even the most thorough search would not discover it. "You speak in generalities, monsieur," Miss Mallory said, her voice gaining strength. "Where is your proof?" Poirot smiled with the satisfaction of a chess master approaching checkmate. "Inspector Davies, if you would be so good as to accompany us to the chapel. There is something I believe we shall find there, something that has been waiting patiently for discovery." The procession to the chapel moved with funeral solemnity through corridors that seemed to hold their breath. In the sacred space, now cold and austere in the lamplight, Poirot moved directly to the front pews where the kneelers lay in neat rows. "The perfect hiding place," he observed, running his fingers along the embroidered covers, "is not one that cannot be found, but one that will not be searched. Who would disturb objects of devotion in a consecrated space?" He paused at the third kneeler from the altar rail, noting how its cover sat slightly askew. With delicate precision, he lifted the fabric to reveal a carefully opened seam, recently stitched with black silk thread. "Mademoiselle," he said, turning to Miss Mallory, "would you care to demonstrate how this was accomplished?" For a moment, her mask slipped entirely, revealing the calculating intelligence that had enabled Ellen Morrison to survive Millfield Institution and reinvent herself as the perfect companion. Then she stepped forward with the resigned dignity of someone who understood that the game had finally ended. From the opened seam, she withdrew the Ashcombe star, small, cold, and utterly indifferent to the human drama that had surrounded its theft. "I intended to return it," she said quietly, her voice carrying neither defiance nor apology. "When the investigation concluded, when suspicion had settled elsewhere, it fell during the ceremony. I feared theft by someone less principled." "No, mademoiselle," Poirot said gently. "It did not fall. You guided its descent with silk thread, using the darkness you had carefully arranged. But the theft of the star was not your primary objective. It was camouflage for a far more serious crime." Miss Mallory's composure cracked slightly. Sir Lionel was a vindictive man who delighted in others' misfortunes. He would have destroyed me for the simple pleasure of watching me fall. "So you destroyed him first," Poirot observed. "But the execution of this crime required knowledge and assistance beyond your capabilities alone. The Laurel compound, the precise timing, the electrical manipulation, you did not work alone." The silence that followed was absolute, broken only by the soft hiss of wind against leaded glass. Somewhere among the assembled witnesses, Poirot's words had found their mark, and the perfect crime was beginning to unravel like a poorly woven tapestry. "Tomorrow," he announced with quiet authority, "we shall discover who provided the expertise that made murder possible. Tonight I suggest that conscience might provide a more comfortable resolution than continued deception." As they prepared to leave the chapel, Miss Mallory, or Ellen Morrison, stood with the star in her hands, no longer the invisible companion, but a woman whose carefully constructed life had finally collapsed under the weight of its own contradictions. The Christmas candle conspiracy was approaching its final act, and somewhere among the departing figures walked a murderer whose perfect crime was about to be exposed by the inexorable logic of Hercule Poirot's little grey cells. The chapel fell into a silence so complete that the soft hiss of wind against leaded glass seemed thunderous. Miss Mallory stood with the star in her hands, her carefully constructed identity finally exposed. Yet Poirot's green eyes had moved beyond her to scan the faces of the assembled witnesses. The little grey cells had imposed their order, but the pattern was not yet complete. The theft of the star, while ingenious, was indeed secondary, Poirot continued, his voice carrying the quiet authority of absolute certainty. But the murder of Sir Lionel required expertise beyond Mademoiselle Morrison's capabilities. The Laurel compound, the precise timing of the electrical failure, the intimate knowledge of both the chapel's systems and Sir Lionel's habits. These demanded a collaborator with entirely different qualifications. His gaze settled on Reverend Pritchard, who stood frozen near the altar rail, his prayer book clutched so tightly his knuckles had gone white. The tremor in the rector's hands had intensified, and perspiration beaded his forehead despite the chapel's winter chill. 20 years of service in this parish, Monsieur le Recteur, Poirot observed with gentle inexorability. 20 years of understanding every peculiarity of this ancient building grafted with modern conveniences. You explained yourself how the electrical system sometimes draws too much power at once and trips the main breaker. A most convenient fault for someone who understood precisely how to exploit it. Pritchard's voice emerged as barely a whisper. I only meant to explain the technical difficulties. Indeed. And your early morning visit to the chapel, ostensibly to pray for Sir Lionel's soul, provided the perfect opportunity to ensure no evidence remained of your preparations. The laurel compound required careful application to the central candle, you see. Too little, and Sir Lionel might have survived with merely discomfort. Too much, and the scent would have been unmistakable to everyone present. Lady Isabel stepped forward, her face pale with dawning comprehension. Arthur, surely you cannot mean, I am afraid, madame, that your rector possessed both the botanical knowledge and the technical expertise necessary for this crime. The bay laurel grows abundantly in rectory gardens, a traditional herb with medicinal properties in small doses, lethal in concentrated form. And who better to understand the precise moment when the electrical system would fail than the man who has wrestled with its temperamental nature for 2 decades? Miss Mallory, Ellen Morrison, finally spoke, her voice carrying neither defiance nor apology. He understood what Sir Lionel would do to us both. Arthur had indiscretions in his past, connections to certain institutions that Sir Lionel had discovered. We were both trapped by that vindictive man's cruelty. Pritchard's composure cracked entirely. The prayer book fell from his nerveless fingers, striking the stone floor with a sound like a judge's gavel. Lionel delighted in others' misfortunes, he said, his voice rising with desperate justification. He held our secrets like weapons, demanding favors, twisting our consciences. When Ellen came to me, desperate with her plan for the theft, I saw a way to free us both from his tyranny. So you provided the method, Poirot concluded with quiet sadness. The laurel essence, carefully prepared in your rectory kitchen using knowledge gleaned from ancient herbals. The precise timing of the electrical failure, achieved by your intimate understanding of the system's weaknesses. The knowledge that Sir Lionel would insist upon lighting the tapers himself, leaning close to the central flame where the heated compound would release its deadly vapors. It was meant to be swift, Pritchard whispered, tears streaming down his thin face. A heart attack, natural causes. No one was supposed to suffer, but when the darkness came and he reached for the taper holder, he stopped, unable to continue. The silver handle, wiped with a cloth moistened with the same compound, Poirot supplied gently. Absorption through the skin provided additional assurance. You took no chances, Reverend. This was not a crime of passion, but of calculation most precise. Inspector Davies stepped forward, his handcuffs gleaming in the lamplight. Reverend Arthur Pritchard, I arrest you for the murder of Sir Lionel Ashcombe. Ellen Morrison, you are charged with theft and conspiracy to murder. As the 2 conspirators were led away, Pritchard broken by confession, Morrison maintaining her composure even in defeat, Lady Isabel remained in the chapel, staring at the altar where the star candle still burned with its innocent flame. 2 people I trusted completely, she whispered. How does one recover from such betrayal? Poirot regarded her with the compassion earned through witnessing humanity's capacity for both evil and redemption. One recovers, madame, by understanding that trust, once broken, may be rebuilt, but only with greater wisdom. The perfect crime exists only in the imagination of those who commit it. Truth, like candlelight, will always find a way to illuminate the darkness. The Christmas candle. Conspiracy had reached its resolution, but the human cost would linger long after justice had been served. The morning sun cast long shadows across the snow-covered grounds of Everley Court, as the immediate shock of revelation gave way to the quieter work of understanding. In Lady Isabel's study, the fire crackled with civilized warmth while she poured tea with hands that had finally ceased their trembling. The Ashcombe star rested in its velvet-lined box on her desk, returned to its rightful place but somehow diminished by its brief exile into the realm of human treachery. Nicholas stood beside the window, his pale features bearing the particular relief of a man whose inheritance was no longer shadowed by suspicion. The scar along his jaw seemed less pronounced now, as if the weight of cleared conscience had restored some natural color to his complexion. "The irony is almost unbearable," Lady Isabel observed, her voice carrying the hollow quality of someone still processing betrayal. "I trusted them both completely. Arthur had been our spiritual guide for 20 years, and Eleanor, I thought her the perfect companion. Quiet, efficient, utterly dependable." Poirot adjusted his gloves with characteristic precision, his green eyes thoughtful. "The perfect crime, madame, often depends upon the perfect disguise. Ellen Morrison understood that invisibility is the greatest camouflage. Who suspects the person who exists only to serve others? And Reverend Pritchard possessed the dual advantages of moral authority and intimate knowledge of your household's rhythms." "But surely there were signs," Nicholas interjected, his voice carrying the frustrated tone of someone reviewing missed opportunities. "Some indication of their true natures?" "Indeed there were, monsieur, though they required the proper perspective to interpret. Miss Morrison's reaction to the name Millfield, her access to the chapel preparations, her knowledge of where evidence might be hidden, all pointed to someone whose past was not what it appeared. Reverend Pritchard's trembling hands, which I initially attributed to age or nervousness, were actually the result of his botanical experiments with laurel compounds. The substance leaves traces that cause mild neurological effects with prolonged exposure." Inspector Davies entered at that moment, his official business concluded, but his expression troubled. "The confessions are complete," he reported. "Pritchard has provided full details of the preparation and execution. Morrison maintains she intended only theft, but admits to providing the distraction and coordination. They'll both face trial, though Pritchard's cooperation may earn him some consideration." Lady Isabel set down her teacup with deliberate care. "And my brother-in-law, his investigation into their backgrounds. Sir Lionel possessed the fatal combination of thoroughness and vindictiveness," Poirot replied with gentle regret. "His discovery of Ellen Morrison's true identity provided him with a weapon he intended to wield cruelly. They understood that exposure meant not merely dismissal, but prosecution and public disgrace. When cornered, the human heart is capable of extraordinary calculation." As Davies departed, Poirot gathered his coat and hat, preparing for the journey back to London. Lady Isabel watched him with the particular attention of someone who understood that wisdom was departing with him. "There is one final matter," she said, "the star candle ceremony. It has been our tradition for generations, but after what has occurred, traditions, madame, are not invalidated by the evil done in their name," Poirot replied with quiet conviction. "The candle burned innocently. It was human hands that corrupted its purpose. Perhaps next Christmas, when grief has softened to memory, the ceremony might resume with greater appreciation for the light it represents." As his motor car pulled away from Everley Court, Poirot watched the ancient house recede into the winter landscape. The snow continued to fall, covering the footprints and tire tracks, erasing the physical evidence of the drama that had unfolded within those walls. But the human consequences would linger far longer than any winter storm. In his notebook, he made a final entry: "The Christmas Candle Conspiracy. Resolved through the application of method and the understanding that the perfect crime exists only in the imagination of those who attempt it. 2 lives destroyed by secrets, 1 life lost to vindictiveness, and a family's trust shattered by deception. The little grey cells have done their work, but the heart finds no satisfaction in such victories. The train to London carried him away from Everley Court, away from another human tragedy solved through logic and observation. Behind him, the great house settled into its winter quiet, forever changed by the events of one Christmas Eve, when tradition became the stage for murder, and trust revealed itself as humanity's most dangerous luxury. In the chapel, the star candle had finally burned down to nothing, its flame extinguished by time rather than treachery. But somewhere in the darkness, new candles waited to be lit, carrying with them the eternal hope that light might triumph over the shadows cast by human frailty. The Christmas Candle. Conspiracy was concluded, another testament to the inexorable truth that no crime, however perfectly planned, can long withstand the patient application of reason in the relentless pursuit of justice.